Industrial Maritime Strategy. І я хотів би запросити до слова генерального секретаря Team Europe пана Крістофа Тітгата. Mr. Крістоф, you're welcome. Welcome on board. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chairman. I hope you can hear me.
Absolutely well.
Fantastic. That's already a first step. First of all, thank you for the invitation, and thank you for giving me a bit of time to speak about an important topic that is now very high on our political agenda in Brussels. After many years of, I would say, blood, sweat, and tears, we managed to have the politics in Brussels looking into the industrial maritime strategy. I have made a small PowerPoint presentation. I don't know whether you have it in front of you, but whilst you are looking for it, and whilst it is coming, just next slide, few words about Team Europe. For those of you who would not yet be familiar with the organization, we represent the European shipyards and maritime equipment manufacturers in the EU member states, Turkey, Norway, the UK, and Ukraine. And nowadays we present ourselves under the header maritime manufacturing industry, because that's also the term that the European Commission is using nowadays. And what we do in Brussels is that we predominantly do lobbying, we organize networking possibilities, and then we monitor and do updates on policy evolutions, legislation, and market updates. And we are, let's say, having different functions, not just in Brussels, but also in an international context, in the context of the International Maritime Organization in London, not under our name Team Europe, but under our name CESA. And the next slide, just a few words about who we represent. We represent more than 300 shipyards across Europe, as I mentioned, more than 28,000 maritime equipment manufacturers of all sizes, 145 billion annual production value, 1.1 million jobs in maritime regions across Europe, and 43% of the global maritime equipment market. That's who we are and who we represent. Now, on the next slide, I will dive into the industrial maritime strategy, and my intention is to explain where we come from, what are we talking about, and what do we expect for the next months. First of all, why did we embark on an industrial maritime strategy? You need to know that until recently, the European Union, European Commission in the first place, was of the opinion that any industry should have what they called a horizontal strategy, horizontal policy. So basically strategies and policies that across to everybody in the same manner, regardless of your needs, your challenges, and so on. And this is very remarkable because since a couple of years, shipyards and maritime equipment manufacturers were qualified, were labeled as a strategic sector. As a strategic sector, you actually want a very strategic sectoral strategy. So gradually, a number of events like the pandemic, like the aggression on your country, but also more recently, more tensions and uncertainties with the United States following the elections of Mr. Trump, and also China being qualified as a systemic rival, all started to change the mindsets in Brussels. And not just politically, but also in the industry, we saw a grouping of various industries joining forces, calling for very dedicated strategies that basically balance the climate agenda that the EU has with the specific needs that each sector, each industry has. And the change, the geopolitical context has, of course, also created a political mindset that Europe has become too dependent on foreign nations. If you look at shipbuilding, we all know that 90 to 95% of merchant shipbuilding nowadays is built in Asia, which creates an economic but also a strategic risk. And we still have an industry in Europe. We are not in the same, let's say, difficulties as the United States, where they have a naval shipbuilding industry, but no meaningful commercial shipbuilding industry. We still have it in Europe, even though it is more limited than it was before. And there is what we call cross-fertilization. So there is an influence from commercial shipbuilding to naval shipbuilding and vice versa. And this changed political context and this acknowledgement that if we don't do anything, we may further lose industrial base in Europe, including maritime industrial base in Europe, and that would even create more dependencies and dangers, have actually been the basis for the discussions on the industrial maritime strategy. The next slide basically explains where we come from. This is a process that I embarked on since I am in Europe, starting since 2016. But as I mentioned, the first years, it took a lot of time because the mindsets were not yet ready. But since end of 2022, we saw for the very first time a call for an industrial maritime strategy, and that was in the context of the European Economic and Social Committee, where employers and trade unions sit together and can make opinions on Commission proposals, but can also make suggestions to the European Commission for policy. And this was clearly the very first step. Then in this Europe context, we also discussed this idea, and mid-2023, we kind of had a general agreement amongst our members that indeed an industrial maritime strategy is needed for shipyards and equipment manufacturers across Europe. 2024, last year, was in fact, let's say, a year of political acceleration. We saw the three main European institutions, starting from the European Parliament, followed by the European Commission, and also the ministers that are gathering in the Council of Ministers, all recognizing the need or all calling for an industrial maritime strategy. Also, Mr. Draghi, who made his famous report after the summer break, acknowledged the strategic needs and the pressure that European shipyards are under. And end of last year, Ms. von der Leyen, when she was, let's say, installed for second term, made a very clear plea to the Transport Commissioner for a maritime industrial strategy, but she even added a very important part on it. You need, Transport Commissioner, you need to make an industrial maritime strategy for the maritime manufacturing industry. In other words, for the shipyards and the maritime equipment manufacturers. And this was a very important addition that was not yet made before by the other institutions earlier in the year, and which actually really underlined the recognition that our industry needs to be taken care of, and business as usual would no longer be an option. Now, in the next slide, you will see that at the moment we are still talking about a political concept. So the idea, the concept of the industrial maritime strategy is accepted, but there is no content yet. That content is now under development. We will very soon, any days now, see the launch of a small public consultation that is called the Call for Evidence, whereby the European Commission will ask any stakeholder, any interested person, to give his opinion on what he or she thinks should be the content of a maritime industrial strategy. That call for evidence will be followed by a meeting with CEOs and Commission officials. But next to that, and this is where the real work is done, there will be ongoing discussions between stakeholders like Sea Europe and the various Commission services to come to a text, to come to a concrete strategy that we can expect by the end of this year, because this was also clearly indicated in one of the Commission documents earlier this year, known as the Competitiveness Compass. We need to, or we can expect that strategy by the end of this year. How it would look like, we don't know. We in Sea Europe are, of course, very active on it. And what we really want is a strategy that is not just words, but actions and finance that will truly help the entire industry. And last week in Poland, the Polish EU presidency was successful in adopting a political declaration known as the Chechen Declaration, because that was the place where the declaration was ultimately agreed upon and signed. A declaration that precisely identifies or defines what can be or what should be in the minds of 20 out of 27 member states the content of a industrial maritime strategy. Now, in the next slide, you will see that Team Europe, of course, has already been preparing this exercise for quite some time. What we want is, as I mentioned, an impactful strategy. And what we actually really want is that we maintain, but also reinforce the industrial capacity, the industrial base that we have in Europe, whilst reinforcing our competitiveness. And we are targeting not all the shipbuilding markets. We are targeting very specific markets that are strategic for Europe and for Europe's economic security, and that also give us the necessary volume that at the moment or in the past years we have been lacking. We identified very concretely the ship types and the assets that we are looking at, and these are in the sphere of the military and security. So, for instance, the Navy ships, also the complex ships that we are still building, like the cruise vessels, retrofit and conversion of the existing ships, which of course has to do with the climate agenda of the European Commission. But also we are targeting the ship types that are operating, let's say, closer to the shore, that are operating in what we call the short sea trade, which is, let's say, the transport of the goods and the people that are connecting the regions in Europe. And of course, also the blue economy, so broader than maritime alone, supply, offshore, renewable energy, and so on, are part of that. In the next slide, you see that the position that we have developed and that we will submit to the European Commission as our content for the strategy is basically looking at 6 pillars, going from competitiveness to security and defense, sustainability, so the climate agenda, innovation and digitalization, but also the skills and the social dimension, because we have quite some challenges when it comes to the workforce. And these 6 pillars, and that you will see in the next slide, are developed into 21 policy recommendations. I have not listed all the policy recommendations, but I've listed some of them so that you have an idea of what we are actually trying to do. It goes from investing into shipyard capacity and in, let's say, enhancing the efficiency and automation and the robotization of the ship production process, to stimulating supply and demand of clean vessels, clean technologies, support fleet renewal and fleet retrofit, support investments in research, development, and innovation. And the money, the investments that we are looking at are not just public investments or money that is coming from the public side, but also from private banks, where there are quite some challenges at the moment. And we are, of course, also monitoring what is happening in the United States. So one of the proposals we are also asking for is to establish in the European Commission a so-called EU Maritime Economic Security Office that is actually monitoring all the strategic economic risks that we may encounter in the entire maritime supply chain. That is, in a nutshell, what we are talking about, what we can expect, and what we from the Europe side hope will be the content of an industrial maritime strategy. Thank you very much.
Thank you for putting us in line with the strategic developments in maritime community of Europe. It's absolutely critical for the particularly for the companies presented here and the companies who are the members of the maritime cluster of Ukraine to be in line with these developments, to see the perspective, to understand the ways, the paths we should follow. And thank you again for joining us today. I have to say that Maritime Cluster is representing the Ukrainian companies in the board of Team Europe. And before I will pass the word to our next speaker, we have to say that, and we already mentioned it in the beginning of our today discussion, that many instruments are already available for Ukrainian companies for practical